this is just an opportunity, as I see it, for us to share
Yeah.
things that we have tried and found to work, or an opportunity to ask for some information that may help something work better than it has. And I'll ask you for help too as I go through some of the problems that I've encountered probably. I've brought materials here for purposes of showing us what is called a string casting method of making a plaster cast. And I will talk you through the process of modeling the head, installing the strings, and making the plaster cast so that a plastic wood head can be made from it. This is a plastic wood head. There's another. I've also...
Do you make it for the head to be hollow?
Yes, the head is hollow. I've also brought materials to demonstrate what I think may be a fruitful method of anticipating proportion, and since I tend to work in a realistic scale, a realistic mode, joint limitation. I've taken from an anatomical chart the relative lengths of all of the major bones in the body and transferred them into a 2-foot tall male marionette figure, with the intention that I'd use that as a standard from which I could depart at will if I were to choose to do so. And I've traced parts, front and side view on the right here, which I regard as a standard design of a marionette. This is something I always do when I'm doing a marionette. I do a front view and a side view and put them on the same sheet, making sure that all of the lengths match, and then proceed from there. On this other sheet, I've taken a side view only and taken the pieces separately and jointed them at the extreme limit of one of their moves, so that the arm is tucked into a closed stance. The head is turned down toward the chest. The chin's dropped onto the chest. The body is bent forward on the hip. The knee is bent to the extreme that I think may be appropriate, and the toe is raised in the foot to a maximum. Now, I could have shown it flexed in the opposite direction in each one of those joints from the side view, but it's only for purposes of illustrating how to use these templates. In every case, I think it makes sense to start with a desire or an intention, a plan in mind. Why is it I'm doing this? What is the nature of the thing I'm doing? I tend to focus very much on characterization as a reason for doing the puppet. Yesterday I sat down to make a head just for purposes of this demonstration, and I got interested in the character that started to emerge in this. And after about an hour's time, I ended up with a character which is based on U.B. Blake,
Yeah.
who has recently died. It's, I'm sure, not a portrait of U.B. Blake, but it is intended at an interior psychological emotional level to express my feelings that I got from watching him the 2 or 3 times I was able to see him on television doing a concert and talking with his audience and being interviewed. And his personality, as much as I could see and feel of it over the television picture and listening to him, has emerged from me. I feel very grateful for the opportunity to put that forward again in a translated form, no doubt. So, those are 2 things that I am prepared to do. There's another thing. I've brought I've brought a rod puppet that has a particular rod puppet control built into it. It's one that I built at a workshop that I took at the festival this past year. And somebody requested I bring that, so I have that here also. And thank you. We can draw pictures and diagrams. I just picked these puppets up at the Art Institute because the Chinese Puppet Theater exhibit is now ended. Oh, and by the way, the negatives are available. The ones I took of our group,
okay.
I have 2 negatives, and I think they both turned out pretty well. So I'm going to have those printed, and I'll bring those in to show you. I think there's another thing that might possibly be of value or interest that I'm prepared to talk about if our time allows. We decide we want to go ahead and do that. And that has to do with the stringing and designing of the marionette control, just to enable are achieving whatever it was we had in mind in terms of character, as expressed through movement and flexibility that has been designed into the puppet body. Designing and building the body is very important, of course, but I don't think it's nearly complete. That is, we still don't have a performance until we have a control that gives us means of achieving those extremes that are built into the body's potential. It's I'm sure it's amazing to somebody who has never attempted such a task to realize that the design and execution of a performance starts way back at zero with nothing but sawdust and burned fingers, and ends up maybe for some of the audience being a transporting kind of an experience. I'm charmed utterly as a craftsman artist with the process of using what I would regard as emotional, spiritual value or content and intent as the starting place, and ending up through the use of the gross and dross elements of the world and producing something with an audience that is again elevating. But going through this medium, whatever your medium may be, is an entrancing experience. Audiences are wonderful. Okay, well, let me stop talking on a philosophic vein and try to be technical from now on. And please do interrupt with questions. It isn't an interruption. It'll be very much intended. Now, when I start to model a head, other than thinking in spiritual terms or feeling in spiritual terms, I generally, out of choice, choose to use what I would regard as a realistic base. My standard, I think, is, consciously anyway, a set of proportions that relates to human beings, human proportions. There's some exaggeration that I think is advisable, in as much as the figure that I design tends to be anywhere from 20 to 24 inches tall. The face, if drawn to scale, and the hands and feet, if made to scale, would probably not, since those are the most expressive elements, they'd probably not be visible, let alone expressive, at much of a distance. So my tendency is to exaggerate both the hands and the head in terms of its size, probably the feet also a little bit, maybe increasing by half at the maximum. Instead of having a head of X size, it would be X plus half X, linear measurement. I like to point out to students when I'm having classes that the eyes are located about half the height in the head. If you were to measure vertically from the top of the skull to the base of the chin, the eyes center normally at about halfway up. The common tendency is to raise the eyes into the upper third of the skull. And another very common tendency in sculpting a head for beginners, I think, is to place the eyes on the front of the head exclusively, as if the way we see them in a mirror in the morning. I see them on a flat mirror, and I don't tend to turn my head and look sideways at myself. I tend always to be looking straight ahead. I think that's probably the experiential reason that we tend to translate faces into flat frontward viewing objects. It is important, I think, for the purposes of realism and conveying to an audience a satisfactory kind of three-dimensional sense, that the puppet look as realistic from the side as it may impress you from the front. The eye is visible from the side. Most people can see almost 180 degrees. I can see both my hands when held out to the side like this, peripherally. The eye does have access to the side. I just urge anyone to get hold of a skull or one of those invisible or visible men or visible women kits that you can get. I have one at home that I use. And just turn it and copy it sideways. All kinds of drawing exercises, I think, are terrifically important. Being able to copy something without interpreting it, I think, is an important skill to develop. If I draw a picture of a horse out of thin air, I will draw what I remember and what I think I remember, and what I feel and what I wish were true, and a lot of other things. But when I draw from life, I'm learning. With every observation I make, I'm learning and then transmitting or transporting to the page what I'm recording some information. I may or may not be consciously or unconsciously expressing feelings and ideas, but I think the drill is incredibly important. because inevitably we carry biases, and I think it tends to make those biases more visible to us. I don't think we should discard our biases necessarily, but I think they need to be visible to us. Otherwise, we'll be working out of control and without focus. So that's my wrap on standard proportions. Have a reason for exaggerating something. Know why it is I'm making the head larger than life or larger than proportion. And if that explanation has something to do with the value that the audience will be receiving, I think it is most justified. If it has something to do with the value I get from doing it that way, I think it is slightly less justified, speaking as a showman. I think they're both justifiable. Anything's justifiable, can be. But my own thinking is that if we can guarantee the audience a better performance by doing it, that's a good justification. I've made myself a set of armatures which can be removed, and those are for handling and playing with. It's probably pretty obvious what it is, just a broomstick with a piece of 2x4. I drilled a hole in the 2x4 and then ran the broomstick into it, and then sanded and cut the 2x4 so it was small enough not to be too close to the surface of the head when I was working on the modeling of the head. When I have modeled the head, I then divide it into 4 parts with a jackknife, and I've split it down the nose at the front, down the right ear, down the left ear, and made a halo, or a cap piece, which has intersected all 3 of those vertical lines. I'm using 3 thumbtacks, each with a piece of black woven nylon fish line attached to it. The first 2 strings that I've set, tacks that I've set into the head, have relatively short strings. They will be embedded in the crack that I've cut in the face until the string is secured to the post of the armature. That's for the front and for the left ear. Those are pretty straightforward. The tricky one is this right ear. This string, see, I'm reversed. It's the left ear that's the tricky one. This string is longer. The tack is embedded above and to the front of the left ear. I will first run the string around to the rear of the head, cross the string on the right ear, cross the string on the nose, cross itself, and then come down over the left ear, and then down the shaft of the armature to be anchored by these 2 pieces of clay which I've put there. This is plastiline. It's Roma Plastilina number 2, if you want to make a record of that. I think there are 4 or 5 different grades, and that's the grade that I happen to have. I have about 40 pounds of the stuff. It is reusable forever, or certainly for a lifetime. It does not have to be discarded or it doesn't dry out. There's some precautions you want to take to prevent it from getting soiled, of course, for cleanliness. Sawdust and other kinds of stuff in your workspace are not good. Old plaster needs to be picked out to make it easier to model. And also, if you're working with unfinished wood, the wood will absorb the oils out of the clay, out of the plasticine. So it pays to shellac or varnish or prepare the wood surfaces some way. I haven't done it on this. I have done it on the armature stick. But the wood will absorb the oil, and the stuff becomes drier and grainier as a result. Okay, let's imagine now that I've finished the head, and we'll pretend that this is the head now, and I'm going to suspend it with a clamp of some kind that I can arrange so that it doesn't swing with an overhead armature, an overhead arm. And I want to rest the head just about 1/2 an inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch above a table surface, a good working height table surface. And I'll put an oilcloth or something slick, a piece of plastic, an old garbage bag, or plastic garbage bag on the table. Then I'll mix plaster of Paris with cold tap water. I don't know what ratio I end up with, but what I make is a saturated solution. I estimate by eye and by guess and by intuition how much I'm going to need. So far, I've made it every time. I tend to overestimate rather than underestimate the amount of plaster needed. So I'll take a measuring, an old tomato can of some kind of big can. It's a good idea to work with plastic buckets, old discarded plastic milk cartons with the top half cut off, something you can throw away after you've used it so you don't need to clean up at all. Having mixed the plaster to a saturated point, what I do is to take a cup of plaster and dump it in, and then take another cup and dump it in. I don't bother sifting it. I probably should, but I don't. Dump it in. Make sure that the plaster is a good quality and it's been protected from moisture, because moisture in plaster, if it's set that way for any length of time, is no good at all. So now I have maybe a quart of prepared plaster, maybe a quart and a half, 2 quarts, and I dip the head in it to make a thin coating of plaster over the entire face and blow away any thickness of plaster. Shake it off or blow it away to make sure that I've got no dry spots. I want to make sure that the plaster has engaged every model surface of the face. So I dip it in again, blow it away again. Eyes, features, nose, nostrils, ears, anything that is a delicate little crease, you may want to check twice or 3 times to make sure you've got the plaster down into that detail.
Dry plaster or wet plaster?
Wet plaster of Paris.
How do you blow away wet plaster?
Hard.
Really blow.
Yeah. You might take a soft paintbrush and do it. But anything that'll do that, you might take, well, I think just blowing it's always been satisfactory. Wear something you
So
can,
what's left on there? How much?
You dip it again. As soon as you've blown away the air bubble,
Okay.
you dip it in
But
plaster
there
again.
is a layer on there as you blow.
Yeah, you want a paper thin layer of wet plaster over the entire head. Satisfy yourself that you've got that.
So your plaster's pretty thin too.
At this stage only. Oh yeah, it's
okay.
When you first make your plaster, you have 20 minutes to go before you're all done.
Right.
Regardless of what else you may want to do, 20 minutes is when it's going to be.
So you're not taking any break.
Yeah.
Don't answer the phone.
Yeah, put the phone on hold. So, mind you, we've dipped the head and made sure that we have good contact all over. It shouldn't take more than a minute to 3 minutes. You have to relax about this. Make a cast of an egg or something else that you don't really need to worry about, so that at any time you can walk away from it and say, well, that was interesting. Now we have the head clamped into a device to hold it 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch above the working surface. I take a bunch of this plaster and pour it onto the head and use a spatula, which I didn't bring, but just an ordinary spatula, maybe about 1 inch wide, maybe even 2 of them. Pour the stuff onto your oilcloth. Maybe you may want a lip around the edge of some kind to prevent it from going on the floor. Work it up into this form, and don't worry about it. It won't harden immediately, and you'll probably find that you're doing a lot of paddling around with no change taking place. It just keeps slumping. Relax. Have a cup of coffee. Talk to somebody, but keep your eye on the.
Do it real quick.
So that's already been the paper thin plaster that's on the head. Does that adhere to the other plaster that you put on?
Yes, it's all the same batch.
The drying times won't make any difference, or does it? I mean, the drying time of the thin.
We've made one batch of plaster. We've dipped the head in it, and then dipped it in again.
And you've blown that off, so it almost has to be.
I've only blown it enough to see whether it's made a good contact. I don't blow it off. I mean, I'm not trying to clean the head of plaster. I'm just trying to see if the air bubbles are gone that were in contact with the face.
But you have a layer of plaster on the head.
Yes, and that layer is integrated. It's not a joined surface. It's an integrated surface with the original plaster. It isn't one skin and then another skin and then another skin of plaster on the head. Is that clear?
No, that's what I thought what you were doing.
No, we're not going to build this mold up with one layer and then another and then another. It's not like making candles where you dip and dip and dip and each have a concentric ring. It's not like that. It'll be one integrated thickness. But the contact surface of it needs to be secured by that process I was describing. That's confusing a little bit to you, is it not, still?
Yeah, we need the purpose of that contact surface. the object.
Yeah, it's just so that you get good detail. You get complete rendering of detail in the mold.
Yeah.
Because if you had left any part of that of the clay dry, that means that there is no contact with the plaster, and you don't get a mold.
Well, and just to pour it on would leave bubbles,
Pouring it on
and
would,
you wouldn't see it
yeah.
to begin with.
And it's important not to. Yeah, you may have a dry spot that you can't see, and dipping this sucker down into a bucket, a plastic bucket of plaster, you tip it down. You can look at every aspect of it and make sure that you've got it covered. Okay, now the plaster begins to harden so that it'll stand up a little bit into a taller puddle. Ultimately, this is the size puddle that it'll be conforming. And I like to work with the nose of the puppet facing me. And I mark references. Which string do I pull first? And I've memorized the direction in which I pull. I pull the first string, and I go around to the front of the head. This is the one. Oh, remember, it goes over the left ear? Mm-hmm. Imagine this to be covered in plaster. It's a big ball of plaster like this now. This head is upside down in the cast, incidentally. It's right side up now, and this is, the plaster will have hardened sufficiently that I need to pull the string or forget it.
Yeah.
So what I will do is pull this long string first, and I will have indented here with my thumb and indented there, reminding me that that is the first string and it's over the left ear. So I pull the string up. Imagine it standing perpendicular to the surface as I do this. I'll pull the string up and I'll jig-jag it a little bit so that I get a keying movement of the string cutting through the plaster. I bring it around and it cuts its own track. It passes itself just a fraction of an inch, just enough. And I'll pull it steadily until I feel that I've come up against the thumbtack. The head of the thumbtack will resist being pulled through the damp plaster sufficiently that I can tell the difference between just pulling it out of the track and pulling the tack. At that point, stop. Go to the front of the head and pull that string basically straight up, but wiggle it a little bit until you again come to the resistance of the tack. Think of it as standing perpendicular to the surface as you pull it, so that you may be pulling it down or out at the front of the nose, and then slightly up as you come to the crown of the head like this. Come to the stop and leave alone. The same thing with the ear. Now that's the simplest, straightforward kind of an explanation of that. Many people will use a cast with only two parts, front and back or left and right. The modeling isn't so complicated that it needs more than that. I like to work with four because, as you can see here, I have the option of leaving the head, the molds separate insofar as I don't put the cap back on. I can see down into the head. The nose is facing away from you. This is the head. This is the cast for his head, the satyr. I can work the inside of the cast and press plastic wood into the various features and close the seams. I've kind of started ahead of myself here. Let's assume now that we've opened the cast by means of prying them open with a couple of screwdrivers. What I will do, once the cast, as the strings have been pulled and plaster has hardened, is to let it sit for at least an hour, preferably all day. I'm never that patient. So within an hour or two, I'm down there cracking away at it. And I just set up a screwdriver at one of the crevices where I know it's at the thickest part of the plaster. This is a good, heavy, thick place. So here you can see my screwdriver marks right here. That's a good, if you want to leave a thick place along each line, that's probably a good reason for doing so. Because when you shove your screwdriver in and tap it again, you won't be hitting the nose or the ear inside the cast. Then, if it doesn't yield right away, you can feel it go, oh. If it doesn't do that, move to a different location and try it. And if it doesn't do it there, move to 6 or 8 different locations until you find one that's going to cooperate with you. Don't force it. So, by some means now we've gotten all 4 of the cast pieces off the head, off the plasticine head. Set the plasticine head aside to be cleaned, pick it clean of remnants of plaster. There's usually something wrong with every mold, every cast.
Do some people put a oil or something?
A separator?
Separator between that and plaster?
I've never done, but I suppose if you wanted to, you could put a green soap as a separator. Green soap is recommended very often as an excellent separator, and you can get it at a pharmacy in a bottle. They'll pour it out of a gallon jug into a small bottle and sell it to you. Okay, now we have dry plaster cast, and I use plastic wood for the heads. I think the 5-pound cans are the largest you can get anymore. I remember seeing 25-pound cans about like this in the shop at home years ago. Soak the plaster casts in water for at least 10 minutes or until the bubbles stop rising, because the plaster is full of air. This is mostly air with a little plaster. And if the moist plastic wood is put directly on dry plaster, you form a very wonderful bond. And the plaster will just suck that plastic wood right into it, and that's the end of that. So this, again, is a point where we need a separator, and water is an excellent separator. Water does not adhere to plastic wood, so if these things have drunk their fill of water in a bucket, they will not chew up the plastic wood. So I take a hamburger of plastic wood in my hand and press it into the skull cap until it is about, I guess that's a little less than 1/4 of an inch thick. Say 3/16 of an inch thick, approximately. And making sure that I've brought the plastic wood at least to the edge where the string cut defines the edge of the mold, and probably press it over just a little bit so that I make the piece, when it comes out, will have a clear mark of where the end of the modeling is. That way with my jackknife I can just follow that line and trim away the excess, which is what I do. The cap piece hardens underwater with the plastic wood in it all by itself. It doesn't get joined with the others.
Underwater?
Yes, it must be returned to the water to harden. Otherwise the plaster will dry out and we have that same disaster. Pancake again, a hamburger into the, make sure you've found all of the details and then press the plastic wood into it. All 3 of these hamburgers, however, you hold a little bit short of the edges of the details in the cast. Those are all done, and then we just fit them together. As before, you have the 3 pieces, like so. At this point, I would bind them with a piece of inner tube, rubber tire inner tube. You'd probably pay to get motorcycle tire tubes as well, and bicycle tubes, and automobile tubes, so that they'll fit different sizes.
Do you sell your inner tubes out of your cigar?
I've used them. I've used them. Okay, this has all been bound now, and we have open seams. The seams have not been made. Now the purpose for leaving the cap off is clear. Now you can reach in with a tool if you wish, a rounded broomstick, and I lay a good juicy worm of plastic wood along each seam and work it in. I like to work with my hands rather than with a tool, so I can feel it and mush it in, and I've had some disasters when I didn't do a very good job of that. And the plastic wood pieces of the head would shrink and distort and come apart. It would look like a terrible automobile accident. After 24 hours underwater, it's possible to take the pieces out, remove the elastics, separate the plastic wood from the cast, and the nose has been pulled off and one ear is pulled off. Don't despair. That comes with the territory. Just kind of push them back on into place and let them air dry for another day on a shelf or in the sunshine. I don't think it's a good idea to apply heat to them. I think room temperature is better than sudden drying. Acetone is the basic solvent for that stuff. And after it has dried, you can patch it with almost any kind of a modeling product. Probably acrylic modeling paste is one good one. Or you can do plastic wood, just repair it with little bits of plastic wood. Plastic wood will shrink about 10% from the time it comes out of the cast until you've painted your head and put it on a marionette. So that needs to be factored in if you're working to a very careful scale. Anything you want to ask about that? That concludes the fireworks on the string.
The skull cap gets joined after things dry.
That's right. You have the head without its cap on, and the cap with no head. And what I'll do probably is to look at both and then trim what is obviously excess away. Make a temporary attempt to fit them together. Unfortunately, the cap is distorted a whole lot. Just to give you a feeling for what's real. It's probably distorted a whole lot, and it doesn't really fit very well. But I nevertheless proceed. And one of the good things about these thumbtacks in the head is that they tell you which is the front and which is the back. Because there's one in the front and there is none in the back of the skull. So that tells me which is the front. This is the front. I'll end up probably painting acetone onto the raw edges of plastic wood, then taking a good moist worm of plastic wood and working it in to one or maybe both sides, both pieces, and then squish them together until I feel that and I kind of go back and forth like so, squish them together, forcing the excess out, both inside the head and outside the head, until I think it's located where it should be relative to the skull. Then stop, let it dry. Or you may want to just cover just kind of mush down the excess plastic wood that's on the outside of the head, press it up against, so that there's a ridge of plastic wood around the wound. When that has dried hard, then you can sand it. You may find you've left an opening appears, and you can just fill it. You may find that you can work with a tool inside the head to knock away some of the loose stuff that's accumulated around the inside of that wound.
If you were going to do then a moving mouth, would you leave the cap off until you got all the mechanism in there?
Yes, and I would only glue the cap
I was
on.
going to say, then what would you do with the cap?
I would want the cap removable.
Right.
So that with a knife I can just pry it apart, and the door opens, and there we are looking at the rolling eyes and the mouth control. And
So do you just glue that with some glue that you can pry apart?
Sure.
Okay.
And I might even glue it only at 3 or 4 points rather than entirely around. You may want to incorporate that into the design of a hat or the wig or some such thing. You might even want to put a screw through a removable fastener. I'll drop this subject if you don't have questions about it. Something I've discovered in the modeling, I've made a number of modeling tools that I find to be very satisfactory if you're going to be using plasticine or modeling at this kind of scale. One I recommend very highly is just a piece of coat hanger wire with the end rounded, just not sanded, but filed off, and then bent slightly. I find that's one I recommend very much. It's just a piece of wood with a hole drilled in it and the coat hanger forced in with a pair of pliers. This is a broken piece of hacksaw blade, and I've ground the teeth off and made one, and you can make any shape you want to, but those shapes are useful. And I've just cut a piece in the end of a broomstick, and I can force that in so that I'm not holding the metal in my hand necessarily. I could drill it and make that permanent, but there's a value to that. Another tool that I think is a really good one you can make, I've taken a loop of bicycle spoke and jammed that into a little dowel, and this loop is good for carving out hollows in the cheeks and under the neck. See where if I got a hollow. Old dental tools. You find a friendly dentist who will give you things. There's a nail that I've flattened out and rounded. This is good for modeling eyeballs. If you're trying to get in around the corners of the eye and press them, I can make a good eyeball without disturbing the eyelid with that thing. So much, but there's some professional. I made that as a cutter and scraper for big stuff. But here's some art supply versions of the same stuff. So much for that.
When you're sculpting the head, then you need to stay away from things that, like loops.
Unsupported parts of the features will probably break off in the cast and will need to be rebuilt. But that wouldn't stop me from making the effort. At least I have the piece there, and I can reattach it. Plastic wood has a good strength. You can see the degree to which I've simplified this ear. It's very thick, and that one's quite simple. I find that I like to work a feature about half sculpturally and half painterly. Just combine them so that both elements have a part in creating the character. I even paint a little bit illusionistically, as you might if you were taking a role as an actor. You know, the makeup accentuates some of the features you have or suppresses them. But in the case of a puppet, we've designed them on purpose, and I would expect only to accentuate what I had rather than try to hide it, because I could hide it by changing it. Okay.
Can we take a break a minute?
Yeah, let's cut at this point. Take a break.
I have some iced tea and pop and hot tea and coffee. Does anyone want? What? I'll just bring it.
myself.
Okay.
Well, that's a lazy Susan you have.
Yeah, I made this out of an old, came off of raised the shoulder strings with an independent finger up at the top of the control, which turns the head down. At that point, I can lift one ear or the other to turn the head. Not much turning is taking place if I simply wave the wings of the puppet control left and right. I must lift the shoulder strings in order to get the control to pivot the head to one side or the other. Now there are other kinds of stringing that can be done to turn the head while the spine is vertical and the shoulders have not been lifted. There are other mechanisms, but this is a very basic and simple one. Another standard string for me is to put a support string at the base of the spine, just at the belt line, run it to the tail of the airplane control, which allows you to bow forward. Another standard string would be to the hand, and in this case all I've done is to run a single string to some part, an appropriate part of the hand. It's the joint between the thumb and the palm of the hand where I've supported that string. You can locate it anywhere that gives you the effect you want it. This is a continuous string and runs from one hand up through the nose of the airplane control down to the other hand, so that by lifting the right hand, which is typical, and then pulling that string horizontally, I am able also to lift the left hand, so that the puppet in effect is making two gestures simultaneously. So we're multiplying the effect with a minimum of control, of exercised control. The foot control is, as I've already described it, one knee to either end of the independent foot bar. Notice in the side view here that the string runs down through the knee, from the top of the thigh, out through the back of the knee, in again at the back of the knee, and out through the front of the ankle, and then down to the top of the foot. The result is that when the string is pulled, the toe of the foot lifts as well, so that it's not dragging and stumbling the puppet over an obstacle such as a step or a fence or whatever he might be climbing over. I have a nose string also, and you can see it. It's pretty gross. I've just drilled a hole down through his nostril. Sometimes I think it pays to paint the first inch or two of such a string in the same tones as the face is painted, so that you minimize the destruction of the appearance of the face a little bit. You might even want to use a clear monofilament string instead of a black string. I don't care for the monofilament as a matter of personal choice. I find the black woven nylon fishing line to be far superior to it. It doesn't weaken when it gets kinked and knotted, as the filament does, for one thing. Independent special strings, I think the only one I would describe in those terms on this puppet would be the one I've already mentioned, to his nose, so we can look up. Just by tipping the control, the front of it upwards, I'm exercising it, I'm pulling, he's suspended, the whole thing is suspended by his nose. I want to mention the tension that I put on the hand strings. As you'll notice, his hands do not go all the way down and hang limply at his sides. I've made the hand string, the continuous hand string, short enough that his hands are always ready to respond as a pendulum to any sideways movement. If he's walking, his hands are somewhat active also, rather than looking like a doped-up gorilla. Now this marionette, to my eye now, seems very disproportionate. His arms are extremely long, given his body. I don't know why I ended up that way. I may have taken parts from two different marionettes, yeah. I'm going to dispose of him and show you another one. This puppet has some more special strings to it. And I'm just going to repeat what most of you have already heard me talk about, and that is the control, which I've adapted from one that I've seen Albrecht Roser use. This is a 3-point suspension on the hand. You'll notice that there are 3 strings to this hand, one at the wrist, one at the base of the pinky, and one at the tip of the thumb. This hand is not particularly well suited to this kind of an operation, but it'll suffice, I think, for the demonstration. Above the hand, just suspended below the controller, is a T-shaped control. And at the 2 wings of the T, I've tied the pinky finger and the thumb string, and at the tail of the T, the bottom end of it, I've tied the wrist, so that by holding that T in a horizontal position, I can rotate it along one of its horizontal axes and get the hand to rotate. I'm just duplicating the gestures up above with the controller that I want the hand to do. Since those 3 points down here have their corresponding representative points up above, it's a matter of ratio, and the control points are separated by a larger distance than the points are on the hand. I would guess probably that we're talking about twice as a factor of 2. So with half a move up here, I get a full move down here. You can adjust that any way you want to. So it can be 1 on 1 or 1 to 2. Depending on the refinement. If you want a slow and very discrete move down here, you may want to reduce this to 1 unit at the control to 2 units down here, so that you'd move a fraction up above and get half a fraction down below of movement. I've also joined the T control for the right hand by attachment to a single string. This is a continuous bridle string up here, so that by raising one of these T's, I lower the other. Or, again, if I take the right hand T control out to the side, it pulls the left hand T control up as well, so that I can be doing a fairly complex thing by handling this one control. He can be reaching out and waving to somebody over here while he's simply raising his other hand. So that I'm really doing 2 gestures at the same time. And if you watch my hand, you can see there's not much to it up here. It's not a complicated thing to do. And it's reversible, left and right. You can work with your opposite hands if you choose. He has a string at the top of his forehead so that he can look up, and a string at either ear. That's the same as I've already discussed. He has an elbow string, which I've run up to the T. For the right hand control, you'll notice that the elbow string joins the tail of the T quite near to the wrist string. And the wrist string and the elbow string are separated by the width of one of my fingers, so that I can reach in between them easily and pick up the elbow if I choose to. And then I can have him swishing his hand in the goldfish bowl or dipping into the cookie jar by raising his elbow and having still retain some control in the hand. Or I can raise his wrist instead of his elbow, and of course there's a characteristic difference in the impression you get. Now, because he has goat legs, he does not have the same kind of a stringing it through the leg that the other marionette had. And I don't know that there's much I need to say about that beyond what I've already said. He has a tail string. He wiggles his tail up and down. It's just what I've done is to run a string from up near the center of the control up above, down through a little wire loop I've embedded in the base of his spine, and then from there it goes, maybe 1/4 of an inch out to this is a piece of fake leather, or real leather. No, it's fake leather. and it's just tied into it so that he can raise his tail up and down. And he gets excited.
His knees and ankles are strictly gravity.
Yeah, everything is gravity in his legs, except for the corresponding joint to the human knee. This is the human heel out here, and the human toe would begin here. Comparative anatomy. I had a wonderful time looking up references on mammal skeletons. Now there's one more feature that I have incorporated for the second time in one of my marionettes, and that has to do with the foot control. Notice I've put a standard open clamp paper clip, spring-loaded paper clip on the foot bar, so that when I'm carrying the foot bar with my thumb on the paper clip, I can press it and stick it onto that little holder on the front of the control. Now that holder itself is mounted on an axis, which I can then control with a thumb that's holding the basic controller, so that with one hand I can have him walking with a specific, predictable mechanical gesture. Now, if he's going to be very articulate with his feet, I'll probably pull the foot bar off of that axle and operate it independently. But if I'm doing some explicit hand gestures and want him to move 2 or 3 steps, I can be doing 2 hand gestures and walking him at the same time by that combination of things. And you're, of course, welcome to examine him. There's a feature I like to incorporate in marionettes for giving the maximum flexibility of expression, and that is a double-jointed neck. This neck is joined where it enters the chest cavity, and it's joined between the ears, slightly below and to the rear of the ears. I think it's the center of pivot on this one, so that he can have a little lateral move. I shouldn't do that way. I think it gives more expression, a more natural feel if the neck is jointed both at top and bottom. Of course, I think the principal movement takes place at the upper part of that joint. In nature, when I nod my head, I think I don't bend the base of my neck quite so much. But in a marionette, I think it's pretty effective to have joints at both ends, and it's not really that complicated. The price one pays for that, I think, is to have an opening visible under the chin in the neck. I was able to disguise the opening in his chest by putting some fake fur around there. I've used trunk fiber, which is a traditional material, at least in my family, for the articulation of the elbows. I would
Wait,
trunk fiber.
What is
Old suitcases used to be made, trunks, steamer trunks, and the kind of trunks kids used to send their dirty laundry home from college to mom. Or used to. I don't believe they're being made anymore, but they may possibly.
And what have you done? Just cut it?
This is a blade of trunk fiber cut into a convenient form. And I've cut a slot in the lower arm. The trunk fiber is embedded in the upper arm. I've cut a slot in the lower arm, drilled through the lower arm and through the trunk fiber, and put a pin in it so that it rotates around that pin, which pierces the trunk fiber.
There should be. What material could you use if you can't find an old trunk?
Aluminum,
Yeah.
steel, some good plastics.
Yeah.
Good plastic.
Okay.
Yeah, there are different characters of plastic.
The
Or wood.
limbs themselves, did you form those from plastic wood?
This torso I modeled in the same method I did the head that I showed you earlier. This is plastic wood, it's hollow. But I still have it on the armature at home, the original. But it's messy, it's got plaster all over it. I haven't cleaned up my mess yet.
And the legs?
The legs are oak, and they were... I did a profile, a side view of the entire leg and of each element in the leg, so that I put a pinhole where each pivot took place, and laid that out in side view, and decided how extremely I wanted it to be able to move. And then I would overlap on paper the first piece and the second piece, and then I would put it into one extreme, and then I diagrammed what the joint would look like. that would come to a full stop. Actually, the heel hits the back of the foot here. Or the hoof hits the back of the leg to make a stop. I've actually filled in some of the stuff with plastic wood after I found I didn't need all of the holes that I'd made. I just filled some of them back up again.
Are your arms mainly plastic wood? Or
The arms are broomsticks with plastic wood added
over.
and then carved away. So you're seeing some wood at the surface and some plastic wood. But I started with broomstick. And people are constantly throwing out mops and stuff out on the street. Every time I see two of them gathered together in one place in the garbage, I stop.
We are all confirmed trash pickers.
Oh, it's so important. It really is.
Well, there's another skill I bring.
A very important one.
Well, I've grown up in the context of you know, I've known puppeteers, and all the puppeteers that I've known have been people who see at least 2 or 3 ways to use whatever they see, you know, in the way of raw material. We're constantly having to fix things that have gone wrong. Well, other people do too, I'm sure, in show business. I imagine it must be very much like that with magicians. Necessity. You know, what do? Well, we'll use a curtain clip, an S-hook. I wish that could be taught. I wish I knew that could be taught and instilled in people, you know, in children.
How to be resourceful.
Yeah, rather than jump to an answer right away, just scope out the whole situation and see how many possible methods of proceeding there might be.
What's the center of the joint? It's grooved, and then the tongue that's in between, like the elbow.
Here?
Yeah. Is that part of this the sculpture? Or is that an added piece that you?
This piece here, that is added. That piece is the trunk fiber.
Okay.
And of course, his arm has been vastly violated in sculptural terms because
You can bring it.
so I can bring it up. And to me, it's very important to be willing to make the sacrifice of the sculptural value, the static value, in order to gain a movement value. For me, it's a hands-down proposition. It must move well. And whatever I have to sacrifice in order to get it to move well, I have to be willing to sacrifice. I think there's a terrific tendency among some beginners anyway, or those who have not performed a great deal, to make it cute or make it attractive, sitting right before yourself at the sewing machine or the drawing table or the bench, so that the satisfaction is a direct personal satisfaction as a hobby. And although that is a very positive thing in itself, it is not the same thing as putting on a performance. And a performances, as I see it, depend entirely on having adequate freedom of movement. And audiences will forgive the open joint inside the elbow here if the character comes on and presents himself as a character. Now, we don't need to have perfect teeth in order to be able to smile. You're welcome to try him out as a, you know, as something to operate.
Now these plastic pieces then, you just have to draw around?
Yes, these, I'll pick this one up.
For when you're cutting your wood part?
Honestly, I have not yet made a marionette using these things.
Oh, okay.
I made them for purposes of giving
Of
demonstrations and
instruction.
lectures
Okay.
and that sort of
That's why I
thing.
was wondering if you had anything
But,
to say about them.
Harking back to what I was saying earlier about proportions,
There's a challenge.
I have, well, I hope I'm not, is he okay?
Yeah, he's okay.
The invisible
There you
man.
go.
You got a real good shadow on your shirt, though.
Oh.
Yeah, you can see the-
Oh, isn't that neat? Look at that. See all the little...
I've pierced this at each of the points where there's a center of a joint, so that by laying this down on paper and tracing it, and then putting a dot through each of these holes, I've identified the center of rotation for every joint in the figure from the front view. The side view I've done in pieces, in major pieces, here's his leg in side view, and I've done the same thing. And these joints will overlap. They're at the same height. I've checked to make sure that they're very close. They're not quite exact. And what I've done is to draw his front view and his side view. Are you able to pick that up on the camera?
Yeah.
And I've placed the appropriate dots so that they can be seen. And then I've taken both views and reduced them to joints and parts. The upper arm is a single part, the lower arm is another single part, and so forth. The torso is two parts, upper and lower. One is the hip and one is the chest. The neck is a single part, the head is a single part. Now you can see in the side view over here where I've divided through the stomach at the belt line, approximately at the lumbar region. I've placed the joint toward the rear in a rough reference to real anatomy, human anatomy. The center of rotation is toward the back of the figure, not toward the front. The joint isn't in the stomach. It's toward the spine. It's in the spine. So I've allowed, by cutting out a V at the front, a small V at the back, and a larger V at the front, I've determined an angular, the bending. There's a limit of how much angle can be bent there. And you decide ahead of time how flexible do you want the character to be. If it's a tumbler, then perhaps you'd want to cut it way up to the sternum even, so that the thing could put its chin between its knees. You may even want, and I've allowed for it in the figure, you may even want to put a second disc here, have a second joint above the first one, so that you'd have an upper chest, a lower chest than the hip. The knee joint shows the angular opening in the side view, but it shows no angular opening in the front view because it doesn't open to the sides. It opens only to the rear and front. It's important, I think, to make sure that there's plenty of what I call stop in front of the joint at the knee.
Yes.
If you put the joint toward the front of the leg, you're doing two things that will lead to trouble. One, it's not anatomically correct. The joint is central, or very nearly central in the knee as seen from the side. And a second thing is that the puppet will probably break or weaken at that. If you don't make a good long stop there, you have terrific leverage, and eventually in the suitcase or the trunk or in usage somehow, that joint will be strained open and broken, probably. I won't belabor you with approximate angles in each case because I think they can be established by experiment as you decide.
Why did you jog the hip line in the front view?
I'm showing the full length of the upper leg.
Yes.
in this view. And in this view, I'm showing the full spatial layout for the hip. So I've just stopped drawing the right leg at that point to allow you a full view of the hip. I should probably disconnect the lines there to make that more clear. It's important to remember that the leg joint is above the bottom of the hip. It's not at the lowest part of the hip. It's quite a bit above it. The leg socket, you can feel it. It's a bone that's just outside my pants pocket here. I think all I would have to say now would be responses to questions or comments that you might have with regard to the body design. You have anything?
So to make it three-dimensional, this is sort of a model in terms of guiding your stop angles and where you want the joints actually to be located. But you just have to use your eye now to render that three-dimensional.
Yes, I'll show you an undressed marionette again, which corresponds pretty much to what we've just looked at. This marionette, you could translate it into a front view, as you saw, or to a side view with the angles cut out behind the knee and so forth. What I've done is to take an appropriately sized and shaped block of wood in each case. For each piece, draw a side view and then a front view on the same block of wood, and run it through the bandsaw, cutting out almost all of the front view, leaving the things connected. Then turn it on its side and cut out almost all of the side view, leaving all of the pieces connected. By that point, you have 9 pieces, all connected at one end, when you've made that many cuts. And then, by judgment, I decide which pieces to separate first and then finish the job. So I have a very blocky, rectangular sectioned piece which represents, say, the upper arm. And I choose to do freehand carving on the bandsaw after that. It's not very safe. And I have a lot of scars on this knuckle to prove it. I've had lots of stitches there.
That means I shouldn't do it right.
I think probably the safest method to do would be possibly to leave an extra 2 or 3 inches on the piece that you're working on. That is, don't cut the end of the arm off. Leave a throwaway piece integrated. Don't cut it short yet. Put it in a vise and take a heavy rasp and just attack the thing with a heavy rasp and knock the corners off. A rat-tail file.
You can still rack on that. That makes good scars too.
But something that'll shape it quick. There's a Sureform brand carving tool, which is a cylinder, a small cylinder, about as long as a knife sharpener, one of those old-fashioned things you put on the Thanksgiving table to sharpen knives. And that's a good, quick carving. He's not very flexible.
But he sure looks tired.
Yeah.
Now you can show your rod puppet.
Oh dear.
You want to get around where you can see?
Must be getting tired of listening.
Not a bit of it.
This is a rod puppet control that I was given in a workshop. I bought it and saw it in a workshop at the last Puppeteer Festival. It consists of a 1/2-inch dowel stick which runs into a shoulder block and is securely anchored in the shoulder block. The shoulder block is a horizontal oval with padding on top to represent the shoulders. At the bottom of the stick, there is a pistol handle grip. Just above that is a loose wooden ring that slides up and down and can be turned left and right. At the front of the little wooden collar here is a spring taken out of a pinch clip clothes hanger and just driven in and glued with epoxy. These 2 wires are coat hangers, and they're bent so that they pass through the center of that clothes hanger spring and run up to a point here anchored just under the puppet's chin, where another spring from another pinch clip clothes hanger has been embedded into a wooden neck piece. This is a little wooden cylinder which forms the neck, and that's been glued in. And the other ends of those same 2 wires, the vertical rods, have been bent and inserted, one on either side, and then the 2 rods have been taped together so they can't be pulled apart and fall out. The neck itself is the joint which allows it to move up and down like that is a leather thong near the back of the head, which goes down into the chest piece, the shoulder piece, that oval thing. The flexible leather thong in the neck allows you, by moving this bottom wooden ring left and